elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to Society and the State. Connor Boyack is sitting out this podcast episode. I'm Brian Hyde. I'm joined today by Weldon Angelos, and some people will find Weldon's name familiar. For those who don't, I think you're going to find his story fascinating, especially as it relates to the justice system and the problem with mandatory minimum sentencing. And Weldon, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Society and the State podcast to talk a little bit about your experience. Could you give us kind of a summary of your story? Let's start with some years ago, you were arrested and charged with trafficking drugs with a gun, you know, in either on your person or nearby. And as a result, you were sentenced to what many people, including the judge sentencing you to imprisonment, called a very unjust sentence. Give us a little bit of background on that, and then let's pick up from there and talk about what has happened to you since that sentence was imposed and the fact that we're talking to you today.
Okay, well, sometime in 2002, I was working on a career in the music industry, but at the same time, I was also selling small amounts of marijuana on the side to help pay bills until my music venture stabilized. And I was approached by a confidential informant at the direction of a drug task force agent to purchase some marijuana from me. I sold $300 worth on 3 occasions. And that's where my federal case started. Now, the firearm possession, that's a little complicated. So it wasn't like I was running around brandishing a firearm or anything like that. Right. The informant who had set me up never said anything about a gun ever until the end of the case. When they were done investigating me, then the police reports were amended to add allegation. And there were legal firearms in my home that I legally owned when they arrested me. And that's where the mandatory minimums kicked in.
Okay, so
I get indicted. I get convicted on most counts. I prevailed on a few, but the bare minimum sentence the judge could give me was 55 years and 1 day for the marijuana in conjunction with the firearm possession.
And what was the judge's reaction? Because Judge Cassell apparently expressed a very strong opinion about disagreeing with the sentence that he felt he was required to impose on you.
Yeah, he was. He was shocked at it after determining what my sentence would be. I think this was maybe about 8 months before he actually sentenced me. And he tried to do what he could to avoid having to give me the 55-year sentence. He reached out to the jury for a sentence recommendation. He reached out to the legal community. He even reached out to President Bush asking for a presidential commutation. But at the end of the day, he felt that it's Congress' decision, not his. So he had but to impose the punishment. And it was a shock because, Judge Cassell was not a soft on crime judge. He was known for being a heavy-handed judge and known for tough justice. So when it came from Judge Cassell, it made a lot of people listen and take a really careful look at my case. So I know it affected him really bad because he ended up stepping down from the bench, I think in part because of having to do that and advocating for my release. So
the judge felt he couldn't alter that sentence, but nonetheless, you ended up having to serve time in a federal penitentiary, actually a couple of federal penitentiaries. What was going on during the time that you were incarcerated? Obviously, there was some heartburn about this, and there were people, I believe, trying to work on your case. But what were some of the behind-the-scenes things that were taking place to try to address what seemed like a very heavy sentence for a relatively minor crime?
Well, Judge Cassell issued a lengthy opinion, and a very lengthy opinion, detailing why my sentence was so unjust and why I should be eligible for a presidential commutation. So my advocates took that and started building a movement with people from the left, the right. We had former U.S. attorneys general, former federal judges, former federal prosecutors, and ultimately, a few years before I was released, we ended up garnering, I think, a couple hundred signatures from the people I just spoke of, and celebrities and businessmen, and ultimately Senator Mike Lee, Senator Orrin Hatch, but Senator Mike Lee was obviously one of my most vocal advocates. And then we had a bunch of letters sent to President Obama. People were advocating tirelessly. Like we filed appeal after appeal. I had multiple attorneys working on the case, to no avail in the courts. The courts were just like, the sentence is mandatory. It's Congress decision, not the courts. So the sentence was upheld and affirmed at every level. So our last and ultimate avenue of review was president. And so garnered all these signatures and got support from pretty much everyone, from the Koch brothers to, even Rocky Anderson. He was a big supporter and helped get a lot of signatures on these letters. But at the end of the day, that wasn't the president that signed the commutation. My prosecutor ended up having a change of heart. And I think this happened sometime before I actually got out, because he had always felt I should have served a 15-year sentence, which is what he offered during the plea negotiations. And as I got closer to that term, he ended up filing a motion for reduction in sentence, and the court granted it. But I think it was go ahead, sorry.
I was just wondering, so whose decision was it then to actually to release you from prison?
Well, it was the judge. The judge had to sign it, but my prosecutor pushed for it. So he's the one that filed a motion for reduction of my sentence, and the court granted it. So he ended up having a change of heart, and his justification was, at that time, the policies have changed. When I was prosecuted in 2002, it was Attorney General Ashcroft, and he had a memorandum that told prosecutors they must seek the harshest penalties possible, the crimes that have the harshest penalties. And those are the offenses that he felt he was obligated to charge me under based on that policy or that charging memorandum. So, and plus marijuana was becoming legalized, and the DOJ was allowing it to be sold. So the national mood had changed so much under Obama's administration and everything else that had I been prosecuted at that time, he would not have charged me in that manner, and I probably would have served a far less sentence than I actually ended up serving. So his justification was that, I should be released based on all of the, the changes that have happened since I was sentenced.
Now, Weldon, one of the things I understand is that Judge Cassell, in his dissent, or in the letter that he wrote, which condemned that mandatory minimum sentence he was forced to impose, listed a number of other crimes, and I mean like serious crimes, really, really heinous stuff, that nonetheless required less imprisonment or less time in prison than the sentence that you were facing.
Yes, among the offenses were child rapists who would receive 11 years. I think he specifically stated that the rapist of a 10-year-old child would receive 11 years under the federal guidelines. My sentence was 5 times that sentence. A terrorist, many of whom I was locked up with in prison, who received lighter sentences than what Judge Cassell listed, which he listed as, I think, 20 years for a convicted terrorist. And I think a plane hijacker would receive 24-year sentence. And these are maximums under the guidelines. These aren't minimums.
Okay.
These are their maximums. My minimum was 55. So he's made the comparison to show that I could have committed any of these heinous acts, and I would have received a fraction of the sentence that I received for a first-time offense of selling marijuana on 3 occasions. So I think he wanted to, demonstrate how ridiculous this sentence was, and that was the best way to do it.
And just to put that into perspective, if you were required to serve every single year of that sentence as it was imposed, you would not be getting out till about 2051. Is that correct?
Well, it was 2057 was my release date. With good time, I could have gotten out in 2051. So the earliest possible release would have been 2051. So I was out about 78 years old, 79.
What was your reaction? What was going through your head when you received word that your sentence had been drastically reduced and that you would be released?
Well, I had gotten a call from my attorney, and he told me what was in the process of happening. I didn't know exactly what day I would get out for sure. And then they just called me up one day and said, roll up. And I thought I was being transferred. And then when they told me I was being released, like, it was the biggest joy ever. Like, it was, even when I heard I was getting out, that was a big burden lifted off my shoulders. You know what I mean? Because I was been in there 13 years, missed my kids grow up. So it was just like the biggest relief ever. And then when they told me to roll up, it was like a dream. Like it was just probably the most exciting moment in my life. And it was just amazing. Like, cause I wasn't expecting it. My son was going to graduate from high school, my oldest son, on a Thursday. And I got surprisingly released on the Tuesday before. So I was actually able to make it out to see my sons graduate.
Wow. Now, I guess the question I know a lot of people are going to have is, okay, so now that you have been out, you have been given a fresh start. Tell us, what are you doing with your life? What are you doing with the second chance that was afforded you?
I'm making good use of it for sure. Since the moment I gotten released, I've been all around the country advocating for justice reform. I've been, to DC, LA. I started writing a book. I started working on a film with award-winning filmmaker Mark Levin, and our executive producer is NBA basketball star Kevin Garnett. And we've been working on this, building this movement, this Unlikely Allies movement. And I've been working with the Coke Industries, and I've been working with people on the left. We just went and interviewed Van Jones. So I've been working on this documentary, and I got a job, a really good paying job. So that's one of the good things that have happened. But I'm really excited about my film. We got Snoop Dogg in it. We got Charles Koch, Senator Mike Lee, Cory Booker, all these different people. We're trying to build this coalition of people from the left and right to show how much support there is for justice reform. And I think it's just really exciting. Like, I've met a lot of amazing people since I've been out of jail. We went to South by Southwest Music and Film Festival and had a panel with Snoop Dogg on the right and the Charles Koch Institute on the left. So it was like really, something interesting. And that's basically what I've been doing the whole time I've been out. We've been going to Sundance, been appearing on news shows and just discussing the reasons why we need to reform our system.
I think a lot of people have a tendency to just assume that because they have no firsthand experience with the system, and I mean either as someone who's being prosecuted or working within the system, we just assume, those of us who are going on with our lives, that, well, it's working the way it's supposed to, and everything is happening like it should. Obviously, in your case, a very large injustice was taking place. What do you wish more people understood about the justice system, particularly as it pertains to mandatory minimum sentences?
Well, I mean, the first thing I learned was that, I had to learn the hard way that our justice system is not always about justice. And there's one thing, like the mandatory minimums in the law that I was sentenced and prosecuted under are bad laws for sure. But I think the worst part of my entire case was the way the law was applied to me. And I think that was more important than the laws themselves, because certain government actors, decided my fate by using the law against me in a way that wasn't intended by Congress. And I think that's like the most part of our system. I think the discretion in the federal system needs to be returned to the judge, who is the only neutral case participant. So I think that was probably one of the biggest problems with my case, was the way it was handled by all the way from the local authorities up to the federal authorities and the prosecutors. And just like I mentioned earlier, that memorandum that was written by Attorney General Ashcroft, caused a lot of problems. And I think is the reason why I was charged so heavy-handedly. And I think I wouldn't have been had it been a different administration. So I think if we can return the discretion back to the judges and start, getting rid of some of these mandatory sentencing, I think it will bring a little more justice back to the system.
What was the original thinking behind the idea of putting mandatory minimum sentences behind certain crimes?
Well, I think there's a lot of fear mongering, and then a lot of members of Congress were, wanting to look good and make it look like they're doing something. Every time some news shows some drug dealing or some violent crime, they go out there and say, okay, we're changing, we're doing something, and started enacting these laws. That's exactly what happened with the statute I was sentenced under. Started, early on with the assassination of Martin Luther King and J.F. Kennedy. So it was well intended back then, but it just spun out of control over the years. And every few years, Congress upped the law. Because my sentence was 3 charges. I got 5 years for the first one and 25 years for each consecutive offense after that. So for a total of 55 years for just 3 offenses. Initially, those charges were only, I think they were punishable by a year, up to 5 years for the first one, and then 2 years for the second one. So I could have gotten like a total of 5 years for all of the crimes. But over the years, Congress kept upping the penalty to where now you have charges where you get a 25-year consecutive sentence if you're convicted of a second offense that I was convicted under, even if it's in the same indictment. And traditionally, the statute didn't apply like that. It applied if you get convicted of this offense and you serve your time, you get out, you go and do it again, then the 25-year enhancement kicks in. Well, the way prosecutors started applying it and courts ultimately accepted it was you could apply it in the same indictment. And that's what they call count stacking, which is, my case is a prime example of that. So that's what goes back to what I just said a minute ago. It's the way these laws are being applied by people in the Justice Department.
Okay, so returning that discretion to the judges obviously would be a great step towards reform. What else needs to happen within the criminal justice system? What are there any other needs that you see that need to be addressed as part of the overall reform?
Yeah, I think I'm also a supporter of ending the over-criminalization. I think we have too many criminal laws in the books, so I think shrinking our federal code would be also a good place to start getting rid of some of these crimes and leaving it to the states, because the states are better suited to determine, what's a problem in that state. Like in one state, marijuana may not be an issue and they don't want to punish it, and then another state, it may be a problem, or vice versa. So I think the state would handle most of the criminal justice matters, leave the federal offenses for stuff that has a national importance. I think that's one step. And another one, I think, obviously, the marijuana. I think marijuana should be, at the very least, decriminalized in the federal system, and let the states decide how they want to treat marijuana. I can obviously speak freely now. I'm completely out of the justice system. I just had gotten off probation, federal probation, months. So that was a beginning of me completely out of the system. So I feel, a little better. I can speak more freely about my views on this topic. But the marijuana decriminalization, I think, is an important issue, and that's another thing I'm going to be pushing for.
Well, and I think you would find there are a lot of heads nodding in agreement when you talk about the overcriminalization of everything. We've converted so much. We've converted so many things into crimes that even people who pride themselves on, I'm a law-abiding citizen, can't say with absolute certainty that they aren't violating some law at some level. And when even nonviolent crimes are treated, to where you would lock a person up for decades of their life, that does seem to be a bit of overkill. You mentioned that you had started writing a book. I'm going to push you a little bit on that. Do you see a completion of that project coming at some point in the future?
Yeah, I do. I'm hoping to finish it by the spring. It's a really important book. There's a lot of things that people don't know about my case that took place behind the scenes that shed light on our system as a whole. All the way from how the Court of Appeals judges treated my case and what really went on behind the scenes that will shock some people. There are just a lot of things that people really need to see, and I think my case will show that, and hopefully will change some minds of people who don't know what's going on. I even spoke to one of my jurors for my book. I interviewed one when I got out, and come to find out that he was against my sentence completely, and had he known that I was going to be sentenced to such an amount of time, he wouldn't have convicted me. He was actually on the verge of not convicting me, but he said he sort of fell into that groupthink and just went ahead and went with the majority. And there were other problems he said that he saw with the case, because he doubted the informant's testimony, but he felt like law enforcement don't bend the truth. They don't lie. And so, there must just be some mistake, but I still must be guilty. So he convicted me. But he says now he knows more about the system, that he would have looked more closer at the facts than he did. So I think that's important. So I'm hoping to get that book done as soon as possible.
Okay, and there's a couple of things I want to link to this podcast episode. This is societyandthestate.com/65. Again, we're talking with Weldon Angelos. You mentioned that now there have been a couple of documentaries that have been done about your story. Is that right?
Yes, there have. It's a couple of short documentaries. Nothing. We're doing a feature documentary that's going to be a full length.
Okay, so that's something that we'll be wanting to look forward to. Is there anything else that you would want our listening audience to know, either about you or about your story or the overall cause of justice versus injustice?
Yeah, for me, I just like to, because a lot of people, when they like you said in the beginning, they think that everything's working well. And at the end of the day, I always go back to Judge Cassell's comparison. And if we want a system that's truly about justice, there's no way we can have that when we prosecute someone convicted of a drug offense far more harshly than we convict someone who rapes someone or rapes a child or kills someone. Because, I grew up in a bad neighborhood, and I had friends in my neighborhood that committed murder or did something crazy like that, and they got 8.5 years, got out of prison, were able to get out, commit another crime, go back, and still would have gotten out long before I would have had I served my original sentence. So I like people to look at that comparison that Judge Cassell made and to think, is that really the system that we want, that we need, and is that really just to do that? So I think that's an important factor that I like people to know and to think about. And I think that's actually worked with some in Congress who weren't on board with justice reform. I think when they see that comparison and they think about the victims' families and whether the justice system fully considers their pain by, like Cassell said in his opinion, by, belittling what they went through, to give me such a long sentence for a drug offense. So I think that's an important factor.
Well, I sure appreciate you taking the time to share your story with our listeners today. Again, this is Society and the State, episode 65 with Weldon Angelos. And Weldon, I wish you all the best and hope that your future is bright and that you become that agent of change that you're working on right now.
I'm certainly going to try. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.